So good evening. My name is Corey Combs, and I'm here to, first I want to thank Coral and Mark for having me. I'm here to talk about a very specific and unique passion of mine, and that's a collection of instruments, and most specifically, I'm going to talk about the bass. And I've been a lifelong bassist, which is a strange thing to say considering that when I started, the instrument towered above me to the point where I was mocked by almost all of my peers. You imagine going to a typical middle school in Wichita, Kansas, schlepping a bass along and trying to explain to your friends that had no frame of reference what and why you were doing. So it was an interesting choice. Going back, I'm not sure why I made it, except for something in the shape of it appealed to me. My dad was a musician, and I often watched him in the symphony, and something about watching the bassist in the back bow along really appealed to me. I didn't know what I was getting into, primarily that the acoustic bass, which I'm going to show you in a moment, is one of the hardest instruments to play physically, because you're going to face, no matter how good you are, you're going to face a couple of years of physical pain to play this instrument, so it takes some dedication. So I only brought a couple instruments that I'm going to show you today from my collection. I'm going to play a bit, but I wanted to share with you a bit. I wish I had my first electric bass, because that was really when I started collecting instruments. That was in high school. I found a 65 Fender jazz bass, and so for any of you that have a passion for instrument collecting like I do, that might mean something to you. And if it doesn't, I'll explain it briefly, that there's a golden era in Fender's history where they were making instruments like no one else, and that includes the Stratocaster, the jazz bass, and the precision bass. And so I found one of these at the store where I was taking lessons, and I snatched it up, saved money working at restaurants and whatnot, and I kept that bass all the way through college. Sad story that I lost it, and I wish I had it. But every collector knows that feeling of the one that got away. That's my 65 Fender that I was sitting right here with you. But I do have something really fantastic to show you that as I departed from that Fender for unfortunate reasons, I found and knew about a maker that lives in the gold country of California named Ken Bebensee. And I had been hearing his name and had heard players talk about this craftsman who builds custom basses. And as a young bassist, I thought, well, that's just out of my league. There would never be a time in my life where I could call a person and say, I want you to make an instrument with this set of criteria that fits to me. And so this is an instrument that, believe it or not, I found on eBay. So because I was talking to Coral briefly about this before I started, that I have 4 or 5 custom instruments that I had built for me top to bottom. There's a 5-year wait to get one of Ken's instruments, and so you give a deposit, and the neck alone has to sit for about 1.5 years as he shapes it, sands it, shapes it, sands it. And so you have to have a great deal of patience and also confidence that it will one day end up in your hands and be the instrument that you hoped for. I knew it would be, and so when I found this instrument on this country and western musician, had it made for him, waited, and then eventually realized that it was more instrument than he really bargained for. And I'll explain why. So first off, if you know the bass is an instrument, typically it has 4 strings. So those 4 are these ones in the middle right here, right? So this one is unique already in that it has 6 strings. So it's like a guitar. It has a low string and a high string. So already the range of it just on the open strings is different. Now on top of it, it's fretless. So most basses are like guitars that have fret lines that go across to help you know where you are. And it also gives a specific sound to the instrument. So my favorite electric bassist, who again was another one of my heroes that played the 65 Fender, got the idea to, well, what happens if I rip off all these frets, laminate it, put some varnish on it, what would it sound like? And so he crafted that fretless electric bass sound that I fell in love with. And so that's what really drew me to collecting instruments, is that you're collecting something physical and something ethereal, and that you're collecting the potential for sound. And so this is the physical piece, which is really a beautiful piece of work. If you can see, this is that laminate of the neck. He did something very unique, which he carved out this centerpiece. That's hollow, where most of them aren't. There's this active bridge that's different, and there's these pickups, and this, again, this just the build time that allows him as a craftsman to feel patient, to build as he wants to, as opposed to thinking it has to be done next week. And as such, I got to go to his shop up in Gold Country, and it's a really off-the-grid, almost, and I say this favorably, like almost like a hippie commune where there's lots of craftsmen building, and then he's just there shaping instruments. And he made this lovely bass. So, as I mentioned, a big part of collecting for me was the potential for sound, and I think the bass has one of the best sounds, the best man-made sounds that I think can be created, and of course I'm biased. But electric bass is unique in that I just wanted to play that note and let that resonate. So that's a low B. When I started hearing musicians play that and hear that amplified, and I felt the way it made me feel, I was like, I have to have that eventually. And then what also drew me to it was, of course, the bass. Along with being beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, it also is a rhythmic appeal. So the collection includes the potential for rhythm. And so that's what really drew me in as a musician, was the idea that the bass, unlike, say, the saxophone, which is melodically driven, or the violin, which is melodically driven, this really gives me a chance to play like a drummer. So I'm going to give you a little example. And again, this is more to showcase the instrument than, say, me as a player. But I'm going to play a simple groove, and I'm going to do it in a style that really appealed to me, which was funk. I started to listen to 70s funk is what I really started to fall in love with, and I started to emulate and try to imitate. And I had a fantastic teacher who supported my, again, rather esoteric obsession with 70s funk. So I'm going to play a little bit, just, again, a simple groove so you can hear this instrument. So again, just the idea that you're playing some rhythm that it feels good, and ideally, in the best sense, if you're a good bass player, you're making the audience feel good by playing, basically I was just playing quarter notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And that's what I loved about it, is that something seemingly simple, if you spend time with it and you're dedicated to it, is intensely complicated. And then on top of that, I can make all of this varied. So you see all these knobs and all these things over here. I can shape and craft this sound as I want to. I can change the strings, I can turn up the bass, I can turn up this pickup, turn down that pickup. So this instrument has all kinds of potential to change in color. So with a limited amount of time, however, I want to switch to my other obsession, which has been the acoustic bass. I'm going to put this one down. The acoustic is another beast entirely. The electric I love because it's, even though it's not as portable as a flute, and trust me, I've gotten that line more times than I want, that don't you wish you played the flute, when they see me lifting this around, and I'm always happy to say, no, I'm glad I play the bass. But regardless, a commitment to an acoustic bass, which I've been committed to, again, since I was a young person, means that I'm committed to lifting this big hunk of wood around. Wherever I go, if I buy a car, I have to make sure that the car fits the bass. And I've done that with dealers before, where I say, well, I actually have to bring the car back and make sure the bass can fit in. They say, well, okay, if that means we're going to get a sale from you, that's fine. And then, I've had to figure out, how am I going to get from Wichita to Rochester, where I went to the Eastman School of Music? Well, how am I going to get the bass there? Am I going to fly with it? Am I going to buy a case? So there's really a whole ton of logistics that come along with playing this instrument that you have to just dedicate yourself to. And bassists have, over the centuries, figured out ways to make this work. But now imagine, if you're a professional bassist, imagine the restrictions that you all face every day at the airport just carrying a bag. So try to show up with one of these now. It doesn't work well. Even one of those, where you used to be able to put it overhead, musicians are no longer able to do that. So it's a whole different ballgame. So now most people just fly fly, show up, and whatever bass they're handed at the venue is the bass they play. Fortunately, I drove here tonight, so this is mine. Now, interestingly enough, this is a Chinese bass. I've had a few acoustic basses over the years. This is a modern one as opposed to an older one that was built in either 1800s or early 1900s. There are some amazing makers in China that are building spectacular instruments that are actually price point wise, especially if you compare it to say violin or other instruments, relatively affordable. And this, I'm mainly a jazz player, but this, I study classical music as well. And I've had a few acoustic basses over the years, but they are challenging to maintain. They crack all the time. Weather is terrible for it. If it's too hot, the bridge will fall. If it's too cold, the sound post will fall down. So it's, again, it's a commitment to a lifestyle. So it's not only collecting, but it's the maintenance of the collection, which, you know, fortunately I've always loved, because I like getting a little sandpaper out and working and shaping and trying to find just the right way to make it feel. Because along with it being physical, there's that idea that somewhere there's the perfect sounding acoustic bass. I think Dave Holland, Charlie Hayden, and some others have crafted some really just amazing bass sounds, and that's what I've spent my life trying to do, is make a sound that is pleasant. So I'm going to close out by playing a folk song that I wrote in the style of Charlie Hayden, and I'm going to do what's called a pedal, meaning I'm going to play this low D, and that's going to be the foundation of this. So then I'm going to play both the low note, which is going to provide the harmony. I'm going to keep this going, and then I'm going to play a melody over the top, which, again, I talked about this kind of being a groove instrument. I'm going to play a groove, but also I'm going to play the melody. So I'm going to kind of both set the rhythm and then accompany myself as the melodic voice as well. But it's a simple song. It's in the style of early American folk music. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I hope you can get, if you're curious, if you haven't heard these instruments before, there's so many great bass players. I just recommend starting with someone like Dave Holland or Charlie Hayden or Ray Brown or some others who have, like me, dedicated their lives to something that's interesting, off the beaten path, but has the potential for such beauty. So thanks very much for listening.